There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Hello and welcome to Mamamia Out Loud. It's what women are actually talking about on Wednesday, the 15th of November. I'm Holly Wainwright.
I'm Jessie Stevens.
And I'm Elfy Scott.
Filling in for our Mia, who is not well. We just can't catch a break around here, can we?
We can't.
But thank you, Elfy, for stepping in. On the show today, Matthew Perry predicted exactly what would happen after he died, and he was right. Plus, what is the fig tree theory and what does it have to do with sad girls? And do you have to have a university degree to have an opinion? But first, Jessie.
In case you missed it, Kim Kardashian has been named GQ's 2023 Man of the Year.
Woot woot.
And if you're confused, so am I. I Googled,
So is she.
Why is Kim Kardashian the Man of the Year? And why have I found myself Googling this? Because whatever her aim was, it has worked. As far as we know, Kim identifies as a woman. But her underwear brand Skims, which is now worth $4 billion, helped her land the title of Tycoon of the Year. And that is since she's broken into the menswear world with her newly launched men's line and a partnership with the NBA. And in an interview with GQ, she shares all the things she learned from her father, most notably her work ethic. She says, "My dad had me sign a contract for everything. When I got a car, I needed to have it washed once a week and make sure that it had enough gas. And that
She
I
didn't need to wash it. She
needed
needed
to make
have it
sure
washed.
that it was washed." Was the car gifted to her at 16? Yes, it was. But she needed to make sure it had gas, which I'm sure was paid for by her parents' money. I mean, this is just genius marketing. How the hell Kim Kardashian is on the front page of GQ for the Men of the Year Awards? I don't know, but someone is working their magic.
Mia
Holly,
would be very happy because she's wearing clothes.
Yeah.
To qualify as Man of the Year, she had to have a shoot that required her to wear a suit, like a big baggy man
Yes.
suit, and pretend to eat a bag of Cheetos, which is presumably something a woman would never do. Although, hey, I may have been known to do it, and I am indeed a woman.
do you think it's a little bit about queering gender a bit? Are we starting to see that maybe these Men of the Year, Women of the Year, that it's all a little bit basic?
Icky.
I think that this more demonstrates that as long as you have enough money, you too can have the respect of a man. They call her a tycoon.
It's been 3 weeks since Matthew Perry died, and in that time, a few things have happened. The Friends star's funeral, which was very small and very intimate, was long-lensed papped within an inch of its life so that we could all decide whether or not Jen Aniston looked sad enough when we zoomed in on her face. A woman that he dated for a few months in 2006 has been selling her story about the drug-fueled times they shared, times that he's already explored, it must be said, in his extraordinary memoir about addiction, love, friends, and the big terrible thing. Perhaps have also been staking out his house, particularly in the immediate days after his death, and breathlessly reporting every item that was taken out of there. A whole lot of kitchen towels. A burger wrapper. And finding some kind of insight into his final days.
I think you find those things in my house too.
Same. His death certificate was published in full, and someone very close to him, his assistant and sober living companion who lived with him for years and whose identity he went to great pains to conceal in his book, was named and her photograph was published all over the media. Now, I suppose that none of this is that surprising, really. But the fact that this is specifically about Matthew Perry stirred me to write about it on Mamamia this week. I know there are people who go, movie star, why are we talking about that? But after reading Matthew Perry's book, I really see him in a different light. That was a book that was so blisteringly honest about addiction. He has helped so many people who are in that disease. It is a deeply misunderstood thing, something that I think a lot of people understood more after they read that. So I think, that warrants a little bit of credit. I think one of the things that's interesting about the way we're treating him after his death is because of that, right? Because he gave us every sordid corner of his life in that book. I mean, I guess we can't say that for sure. But he certainly did not just paint a sort of flattering portrait of himself. He went to all the dark places. And people say, if you want to expel shame, shine a light on it and all those things. And he knew, and he wrote about this too in his memoir, that after he died, how people would react. He knew people wouldn't be very surprised. He knew people would come out and say things about it, because with an addiction like his that had spanned decades and cost him pretty much everything, death was always kind of stalking him. And I've been thinking about whether there should be a quiet dignity in death for someone as famous as that, and whether that was something maybe he was trying to buy with that level of confession and it didn't work. Jessie, do you think we owe dead celebrities anything?
I do. And I listened to the Out Loud episode a few months ago, Holly, about Amy Winehouse, and I was yelling at you with my AirPods on because you were talking about like sort of some of diaries and
her family had released her private diaries and notebooks to be published as a book.
I hate it. I hate it. And it's because I think that when you die, we almost treat people, they seize being a human being and we turn them into an idea. That feels really dehumanizing. And I've seen that with Matthew Perry. It's not just Matthew Perry, though. You see it with other people. I've had this in my personal life where someone has died and someone in that circle has then either shared an image or an anecdote or a message, and it's really upset the family of the person who lost them because they've gone, we didn't want to talk about that. We didn't want to make that public, whatever it is. And so as much as it's about respect for him, I just keep thinking about his family. So having the last person he went on a date with or an ex-girlfriend saying, I think he was using when he died or whatever.
Even though she hadn't spoken to him for 20 years.
Yeah, you just go, this is your attempt at relevancy. Let the man rest. I hate this idea that we dig through everything that happened and ultimately this person now has absolutely no right of reply. And so their story gets told for them. And thinking one day I'm going to die. I do not like the idea of someone going through my journals and publishing things I wrote. Even if I had a private text exchange and I told Holly something I hadn't told Elfy, is that all of a sudden up for grabs? Like, private memories can remain private. What do you think, Elfy?
I understand the desire to do it. And I think, Holly, you brought this up when we were talking about the Amy Winehouse diaries because you said that she was such a complicated figure that in the wake of her death, people were still trying to kind of like consolidate that information about her, trying to really understand her. I understand what you mean, Jessie. And I don't know, I feel very conflicted about it because on the one hand, I do think also that it's really hard to grieve, right? Like when your life has been touched by somebody else's life, it can be very difficult to try and negotiate how you should speak about that publicly, whether you should do it at all. For example, I had a friend, an old friend who died like a year ago now, and our lives were very intertwined at one point, but then I hadn't spoken to him for many years and then he died. And it was this process of trying to figure out like, how do you talk about it once they're gone and also
publicly
feel like you're
privately.
not serving yourself? Exactly. And like, how do you have conversations with people or like get your message out about this person without feeling like you're trying to serve your own needs in that moment?
Because there's a fine line right there between sort of legacy and paying tribute to somebody and what they meant to you at some point in your life and sort of being seen to put yourself next to the tragedy.
Yes, but it's not even necessarily about what it does to Matthew Perry as a person who is now deceased, because I think that is kind of hard to figure out. But I also think it's like, what does it do to our humanity when we pick apart somebody's life like this? I think it's about looking after his family, but I think it's also about looking after ourselves, right? And making sure that we're not just like digging into these really dark parts of ourselves publicly. I don't know. I find it all quite icky.
I reckon there's a time element in here though, right? Because I'm going to defend slightly my position on Winehouse, because in that conversation I said that I didn't necessarily think it was gross that her parents were publishing those notebooks, because I think it's been more than a decade since she passed. She's still an important cultural figure. People will be fascinated forever by her and her process and her life. I've read lots of biographies of people like John Lennon, which dig into their private diaries and their scribbled lyrics from some lost song. And in fact, he has just been resurrected 40 years after his death by literally his old bandmates going through and finding an old recording, cleaning it up and releasing it as a new song. And I don't know, I wonder, that's defendable to me because it's kind of you're adding to an archive of information about somebody. To me, that feels very different from in the immediate aftermath of somebody's passing, grubbily rifling through it, especially in the case of someone who's been so honest about themselves.
Yeah.
It's almost like he'd already given his pound of flesh, Matthew Perry, to the world in the form of this extreme fame, which he was very honest about wanting. It's not like it happened to him by accident. And then in his honesty about his addiction. But it's like it's still not enough for us. We still have to dig around to like find out something grubbier about him, specifically around how he died. And there's no evidence at this point that that was directly linked to addiction in any way, although his addiction had left him with health issues. So I don't know, is there like a kind of statute of limitations on when it passes from grubby rummaging to like legacy building?
I don't know, because to say that would suggest that dead, we have absolutely no right to privacy. And we can talk about it with celebrities, but I suppose we can also talk about it with people that we've loved. You know, we were speaking the other day about that Ghost Story podcast, and they're going through and sort of reappraising a legacy, which we do often. But looking through all these files, and I don't know, I think about my grandmother or whatever, I still think she gets to have her secrets. Like, I think that even though you're dead, you get to have your secrets. And I think it's different. In the wake of someone's death, your job is to not compound the pain of those grieving the most. That's your job. So even if you're on the outer circle, if you are not people grieving the most, anything you post, anything you say, anything you do, it's just like, don't make this moment worse for them.
This week, we've been talking a lot about fig trees, not actual fig trees, although they're lovely.
Although I could talk about
Holly
fig trees.
would love a little chat on fig trees.
But I won't put you all through that. It's okay.
Are they hard to grow?
They take a very long time. That's why they're so amazing. They're ancient. Like, I will bore you with this at some point. But no, you can't just stick one in the garden and it's doing its thing next week. No,
we'll release a subscriber episode where you can talk about that. But we are talking about fig tree analogies this week. The analogy first came from Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, in which her 19-year-old protagonist felt overwhelmed about the future and reflected on how it could ever live up to her expectations.
I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor. And beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out.
Basically, the idea is that you look at the branches of life and how choosing one path means that you lose out on the opportunity to pursue the rest. Creators on TikTok are making videos about this concept, talking about all of the things they want to do in life. They want to live in the south of France. They want to live in a cottage, open a bakery bookstore. These young people are talking about indecision and the suffocating feeling that every choice you make means that you're cutting off a branch. You're losing the opportunity for a bunch of other opportunities. But is it really worth thinking about all of these branches? And by taking a branch on the fig tree, are we really closing ourselves off to other possibilities? Holly, you were annoyed by this idea. Please indulge us.
I'm not annoyed by the original idea. I'm not annoyed by Sylvia Plath's insight into that, because it is true that every choice costs you something, right? What I'm annoyed with, and it's probably suitable for me as a midlife woman to be irritated by the young people, and it's part of their job to irritate me. So I think that's fine. I was irritated by specifically this thing of like, I want to go traveling, but I also want a picket fence, but I also want a career, but I also want a free spirit. The reason that irritates me is because what you don't understand when you're young is that if you're lucky, life is long. You can actually live a lot of different lives. You can actually live a lot of different eras, as Taylor Swift might put it, for example. It is perfectly possible for you to, if you want to, and you're willing to give something else up, go and be a free spirit and bum around for a bit if you're willing to live on very little and not know where you're going to wake up tomorrow and do all of those things and have adventures. You can do it. The problem is you're cutting off limbs if you chase one specific thing and if you think there is a finite full stop. And that is a very common view of youth, that life finishes at 30. And so if I don't do it all before then I might as well not do it. And then if you're lucky enough to keep getting older, you realize that your adventures can actually be infinite. Like I've still got many ahead of me, right? Like who knows what my next, hopefully touching wood, 30 years are going to look like and the places I'll go and where I'll live and what I might do for work and all those things. Like it's not, over. So I kind of am irritated by this, like, oh, we've got so many choices now and life's so hard because I've got to pick one. And I would argue you don't actually have to pick one. But if you do pick one, you have to make peace with the fact that everything costs you something.
I feel as though what TikTok is really good at is taking a quote completely out of context.
Yes.
And people who don't know who Sylvia Plath is do some meditative dance with like an overlay of that quote. The reason that analogy was so profound at the time and why it is specific to the time is because Sylvia Plath was writing in a post-war America. It was the creation of the American dream. It was prior to the feminist revolution. And she was writing in this place that had sort of the white picket fences, and she was Boston and she went to New York, and it was this big deal for her to do that. But what she was finding specifically was that as a woman in that moment, there were finite branches. There were only a certain amount of ways she could be a woman. And every step she was making, she was going, oh, that one just fell, that one just fell. Now, that's a historical context. It can be applied to now because there is a moment in youth, in 20s, where you go, oh, for the first time in my life, my choices have consequences. And I think a lot of people realize this where they go, oh, I chose to study. I chose not to study. I chose this industry. I chose this. And now here I am. And what? There's this thing that happens, I think, when you're straight out of school where you're like overwhelmed by the potential. And all anyone talks about is potential. And you hear the promising young woman thing and you just kind of go, what could I possibly do? That is an enormous privilege, but that's where she was sort of speaking from. And then you do feel as you go on, well, I guess I won't marry that man or that woman, or I won't do this or whatever. But I agree, Holly, that, you know, I was even thinking, well, I couldn't be a surgeon now. I actually could.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, I actually could be a surgeon.
There are a lot of women who get past a certain phase of their life that's all about other people and re-examine their options and go, you know what? I'm going to go back to uni and I'm going to study X. I know people who are doing psychology degrees they're not going to finish until they're in their mid-50s. They still want to do it. They're still choosing that life. We talked about canon events when you were gone.
Yeah.
And there's no question that, you know, that when you decide to leave your hometown, when you decide to break up with that person, when that relationship comes to an end, when someone you love dies, these are like moments in which a future is closed off to you. But I think that this kind of navel gazing about now we have so many choices, it's even harder, is kind of insufferable, because the point that Plath was kind of making is she didn't really have that many choices.
Look, I 100% agree with what you're saying, but I also want to bring in a little bit of the context of what these TikTok videos actually sound like.
Okay, I love my life and I love where I live. I really, truly do. But sometimes I think about the other things I would really love to be doing at the same time, like how I want to live in a cottage by a river and open a bakery bookstore and just spend my days baking cakes and reading books. But I also want to live in a small town and have a farm and a lot of animals and children and be friends with all my neighbors. But I also want to live in Hollywood and be an actress and go to cast interviews and cool award shows.
What drives me more insane, Holly, than even your rage about this is the idea that these people are so focused in on the aesthetic of their possibilities. So in one of these videos, they say, I think about living in New York and working a professional job and wearing business casual outfits every day and going to high-end restaurants. Yes. And I think there is such a profound naivety built into all of these ideas.
That's what a career looks like, Elfy.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It just looks like a montage of you walking down in New York Street wearing a cute outfit and then going out to a restaurant. This actually builds a little bit into that conversation that Claire and Holly and I have had many, many times now about people who go on holidays and then complain about them. There's just this like flattening of world experiences that people seem to completely ignore when they're thinking about these kind of possibilities. And I appreciate that, yes, there is like a deeper philosophical thing going on here. But at the same time, I also believe that these people are making videos because they see cute girls on the internet doing cute things.
Yeah.
And they really think that they can embody that kind of life where there's no issues and ignore that like life is complicated.
So the comparison culture element of this is that they're seeing the person who lives in Byron Bay and wears linen and has tousle-haired, beautiful little children and whatever. And they're like, well, that's an option that's open to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as if that's really what it looks like and how it is. And they're like, but if I pick that, then I lose the one where I'm, striding around Sydney in power heels.
Yes.
That's what they
I'm
think.
Exactly.
going to broaden it out to the resurgence of plath more broadly, which I think we're seeing. And I think it's to do with the sad bad girl novel that has been getting a lot of airtime, which has been viewed with a lot of cynicism. So if you're like, what genre are you talking about? Plath would sort of fit in, although she obviously did it, 60 years before. But there's sort of Sally Rooney. There was a book this year called Sad Girl Novel. Green Dot would fit into this. And my book would fit into this, which is young women lamenting the world around them, very introspective, very sad, very mopey. There's a general frustration that people are going, cheer up, why are you all whinging so much? And I had to have an answer prepared for this when I was doing book publicity.
I want to know what your answer is.
Gen Z millennial women are among the saddest in Australia. They are the loneliest, they are the most medicated, and they are telling us that they are really sad. You're seeing a proliferation of these novels because there's a truth to it. The fact that we frame them as whingers says a lot about how we view female sadness. When a man writes a book about depression, it's award-winning. And it's very much like he has a serious man issue. Everyone be quiet because it's a man talking about his emotions. And this is very, very serious and important. But when women do it, we're dismissive. And again, that word whinger, I think only goes to women. Like, I think it's something we only do to them.
Look, I think that's a very legitimate point. I do think there is an absolute truth to the sad girl experience. I would say that Sylvia Plath, she's fundamentally different from this new spate of writers who are focusing on the sad girl, because in Sylvia Plath's time, to be sad as a woman was an act of social and political resistance.
That's so true.
And I think that now that there has been this proliferation of the genre, it has become so dominating. To my mind, I mean, I hated Sally Rooney before everybody else hated Sally Rooney. I was a trailblazer. But I'm frustrated because it
Are you
feels
seeing
to
it
me,
as a trend almost?
It's a trend, and it feels limiting to me because it feels to me as though acts of political resistance or social resistance, like being angry, being active, are dismissed in favour of being sad and introspective and individualistic. And that's what frustrates me about it. And that is kind of captured in this as well.
I would say, even though it would be predictable for me to be very irritated by this wave of sad girl expression, and I think you're so right, Elfy, but it's not even that the Plath era was about, it was an act of resistance. It was, people didn't give a shit about female experience then. Like, so no one cared whether women were sad or not. Your experience was entirely irrelevant, and it wasn't, there weren't that many opportunities for female experience to be expressed in any way.
And you're quite literally institutionalised.
So I think that that's a very specific moment. The reason I can't be down on it, this big expression of the sad girl experience, is because I think about when I was a young person, and I'm talking about mainstream. I'm not talking about literary books and literary movies, which have always depicted these experiences in a different, nuanced ways. But mainstream culture, young women were sad then too, right? Confused, repressed, judged, abused, all those things. And there wasn't a reflection of that in our culture. Like, if I think about the music I listened to, and when I found it as a tortured early 20-something, I loved it. I was trying to think about even examples of that today. And I was like, what? Like Alanis Morissette? You know what I mean?
Alanis and she was a trailblazer.
But, but she was also sad and angry. But what I mean is, when I found it, female singer-songwriters, Joni Mitchell, whoever, who wrote about that, you clung onto it like, oh my God, it's being reflected at us. But there wasn't very much of it. Now there's a lot of it because women do have a much bigger voice in the culture. Still not perfect. And I know also that it's a very specific type of woman who has a bigger voice in the culture. But I can't find it in my heart to be too dismissive of it because I know that 22-year-old me would have freaking loved Sally Rooney. Like, 50-year-old me finds her insufferable to a point. Like, good stories, but, oh, shut up, eat a pie, go for a walk. Like, but 20-year-old me would have been like, yes, you know what I mean? So
being a young adult
it's hard.
is awful.
Yeah, it's true.
If you want to make Out Loud part of your routine 5 days a week, we release segments on Tuesdays and Thursdays just for Mamamia subscribers. To get full access, follow the link in the show notes, and a big thank you to all our current subscribers.
Speaking of young women, Emma Chamberlain is a young woman, and you might go, I don't know that name.
Yeah, tell me who Emma Chamberlain is.
So let me just give you some context. She's 22, which is very young. It's so young. She's an American personality and YouTuber, and she's the host of an enormously popular podcast called Anything Goes with Emma Chamberlain.
Being social, traveling, making big shifts in our life, all of those things can be incredibly positive, and all of those things can even be a solution at times to a problem, depending on what our problem is. The problem is when these actions are being misused. They're not helpful steps.
And lately, she has been the subject of a very specific kind of criticism. TikTokers, I think we've got to say that shorthand for Gen Z almost always. Gen Z have something to say and they're yelling about it on TikTok.
It's true.
And they're saying that Emma Chamberlain would benefit from going to university.
I genuinely don't say this to be rude, but Emma Chamberlain's podcast genuinely is just a girl that needs to go to college. I'm not saying that in the way that means, oh, she's dumb, she needs to go to college. She's just clearly a girl that needs to riff ideas with people. And sometimes they need a little feedback, right? Like, I think sometimes she gets a little in her echo chamber. I also think she could benefit a lot from being guided in her studies. I also think it would give her a lot of stuff to talk about because she wouldn't be just thinking of the content and ideas on her own. She would instead be guided by a syllabus or just get ideas from being out in academic spaces, which is clearly the direction that she wants to take her podcast.
I love how much that TikToker has thought about what Emma Chamberlain needs to do. Like, that is just a lot. The criticisms are that you've heard there, you know, broadly that she's in this echo chamber. She needs some critical thinking skills, academic direction, some structure, some research. And just a little bit of context for anyone who's not listened to her podcast. The way it works is that she sort of speaks into a microphone. It's just her. So she doesn't have a co-host or a producer that she's going back and forth off. It's just her speaking alone into a microphone. It seems quite unedited. It's quite, you could say, rambly in the stream of consciousness. I don't think it's prepared, really. I think she has an idea of what she wants to talk about and then she goes for it. I reckon it's very much like the TikTok model, that you would grab a phone or a device and just go, my thoughts for, you know, an hour. Here we go. So an episode title will be about whether happiness is complicated. And it's not like she's drawing on like philosophers or like other ideas. It's just kind of her thoughts. Is romantic love an illusion? She looks at hypnosis. She looks at issues she's having with nicotine addiction. I guess it's kind of like a phone call with a friend where you're not really citing academic resources. Elfy, I know with your friends you do cite academic resources.
I think Elfy does.
Your
conversation is really long.
Have a footnote that come afterwards, which is really fun. Do you think that Emma Chamberlain just needs to go to uni? And what should she study?
I know that a lot of the backlash against these TikToks saying that Emma Chamberlain needs to go to uni, saying, you know, it's elitist. How dare you suggest that somebody needs to get a tertiary education to be able to speak about something with any sort of confidence. Emma Chamberlain can afford to go to university. I will say that with absolute confidence. Also, we should say that like her YouTube career, the reason that she became famous was because she built these videos and all she does is walk around with a camera all day and then like sit in her car after the gym and like talk about nothing. And that's kind of her appeal. Look, I don't think that Emma Chamberlain needs to go to university. I don't think that anybody needs to go to university. But my overwhelming feeling, and if we're talking about the idea that she needs to be intellectually challenged, that she needs to open up her mind to the world, she needs to go get a job at Coles. Like, these people have gotten too rich too quickly. They're shut off in their mansions. She needs to go and stack some shelves for a while. She's too young. I'm sorry.
Holly, you didn't go to university. How do you feel about being
Jessie's
told?
Trying to dress up the fact that the reason she wanted to talk about this is she wants to prosecute the idea if you're only allowed to have an opinion if you went to university, because Jessie's a big believer in going to university.
I don't think everyone should go, but I'll have it on the record that Holly Wainwright didn't. And if you believe that you need a degree, then Holly Wainwright,
Then do
maybe
not listen to anything she
win
says.
every argument on the
Undermine
basis.
everything she
Yes.
says.
Every time you speak, I'm going to go, did you learn that in your university degree?
I feel I don't have any strong feelings about Emma Chamberlain because she is not relevant to my life, but I have very strong feelings about the idea that you shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion unless you went to university. There's a distinction that needs to be made here. One of the things that is wrong with the world is that there are way too many people having opinions, myself included, very likely, about things that they're not qualified for. No question. But I would argue that that is particularly important when we're talking about particularly serious matters, matters of health, matters of international politics, matters of war, perhaps, matters of vaccination, efficacy, like that kind of shit. I do not want advice from Emma Chamberlain about. In fact, I don't really want advice from anybody who isn't well educated in that. That education doesn't necessarily need to have a degree behind it. It could be all kinds of things. But I agree that sort of uninformed opinions being shouted the loudest are making the world worse. But what I don't agree with is that going to university is the answer to being able to think critically. In fact, I would argue that a lot of evidence at the moment suggests the biggest echo chambers in our culture are universities.
I'd agree with you.
And I think that actually that's not the point. It should be the point of pursuing education is to have your ideas challenged and to be able to listen to lots of different viewpoints and learn how to research and back things up. But I don't necessarily think that is what the university system does. And I think there's a lot of snobbery. I also think that the fact that it's table stakes now in countries like Australia, that everyone has to get a degree, is not making the education system better, is not giving young people necessarily the best start because not everybody wants to. I remember one of the reasons I didn't go to university, just to make that clear.
Can you please
defend my
yourself? Because
position?
Everyone's horrified.
It's interesting because I grew up with parents for whom going to university was the single thing that changed the course of their entire lives, their canon event, no question, because they both came from very working class families and no one had ever gone to uni in their families, right? So that act in the 1960s of free education from a Labour government sending them to university changed their lives beyond measure. For them, it was really important. And there was no more rebellious thing that I could do than not go to university, which is one of the reasons why I didn't. I was never very academic. I always loved reading and writing and learning, and I loved history and I loved sociology, but I was not broadly academic. I was never going to be top of the class in anything other than English, perhaps. So I had no interest. So what I did do is I went to what we used to call journalism school. I moved to London and I did a year-long course in magazine journalism, which is such an unthinkable thing these days. And then I got a job, and that's how my life started in that way. But my brother, who also rebelled and didn't go to university despite being way more academic than I did, went back to university in his late 20s, and this is also Brent's story, when he was ready and open for that experience, not just as a rite of passage that everybody has to go through and sit in a lecture hungover. I know you don't have to do that anymore because it's all online, but sit in a lecture hungover when you'd rather be doing other things. There are lots of different paths, is what I'm trying to say, to a well-rounded life, to a well-rounded intellect that don't necessarily involve a university degree.
I agree. And I will have it on the record that I am joking when I make fun of Holly, and that there are a lot of people who have incredible qualifications and degrees who are lacking serious critical thinking skills that I see and I go, that just does not pass the test. However, I reckon that this is a broader response to our rejection of expertise, to any research methodology, to reasoning, to Enlightenment principles, to discourse and debate, all the things that since the Enlightenment we have built up in terms of this is how we get to knowledge, have been completely dismantled with the rise of a phone in our hands.
Yep.
And that's terrifying. And
well, it is, but it isn't, because you can also argue that the gatekeepers of that world
True.
meant that knowledge and power sat in this tiny, and it still does, to be honest. Now it sits with the billionaires who run the tech companies who run our lives. But the gatekeeping to all knowledge was very narrow then. And now if you do want to learn, it's more accessible.
But I do think that maybe that band has expanded slightly beyond where it should be.
Yes. Like you get on your phone or whatever and the stuff you're consuming, like say a war, I want someone speaking to me with a degree of expertise.
100%.
There are find facts. You can find it, right? But if you're looking at an algorithm or you're looking at a feed, there's no reason, not that Emma Chamberlain is doing this, but like that someone with a microphone goes, I've seen 2 TikToks and I've got a thing to say. And I don't think that's helping. In fact, I think it's doing the opposite. You know, if you fly a plane or if you're a surgeon or if you're a teacher, you need to learn certain skills. That doesn't mean that I think everyone should go to university, but there is a training that you have to do before you get into that occupation. And the fact that you can have such influence and sit behind a microphone and have access to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, without that, I find concerning.
She says into a microphone.
I do.
Hundreds of thousands of people.
But you are not a good example of this because obviously you are very well researched in almost every opinion you espouse, but you're not an expert in a lot of the stuff you talk about. And yet you're very confident expert.
Yes.
You'll often hear me say, like, I don't think I'm qualified to speak on that. You'll never hear Jessie Stevens say that.
May I defend myself?
That's because she's very smart.
Exactly.
She went to university.
Sorry, I went to university. I have a master's degree.
Did you hear?
Should I have a master's degree. I'm qualified to talk about everything. I'm not. But what I do believe that is if you are someone who is talking into a microphone for a living, then your input must be greater than your output. And I've seen this happen with the likes of, say, Jordan Peterson, where he was this research person. Every now and then he said something and you went, oh, he's a researcher, he's a lecturer, he's a psychologist, he's got something to say. And then they stop reading and only speak. And then you go, oh, this is getting very dangerous. You get carried away with yourself.
Actually a very good example because all the credibility that Jordan Peterson has comes from the letters after his name and the fact that he's a university professor. And still, I wouldn't argue that he's making the world any better.
No,
I don't.
know.
I fully agree with you that uninformed opinions shouted loudly are making the world worse. But I'm not more likely to listen to you speak about a specific issue because you've got a university degree in something completely different.
Although I would say
in something different,
that going to university can imbue you with certain skills that other people would not have access to.
Yeah.
And I would include general idea of epistemology in that, like the science of knowledge, how we build knowledge and, you know, kind of questioning and challenging yourself about things like that. Learning about that, I mean, I sound like such an asshat saying epistemology to begin with. It made me shut up more. And I think that that's important sometimes.
Yeah, and basic research skills, because I think that what we're seeing from the likes of Emma Chamberlain is that everything is personal experience. And that's also like a sort of a feminist legacy of personal reflections. But you run out really quick. And if your only access, and I know we do this is part of what we do, but if your only access to any subject is through your own lens and your own experience, then you're very limited. And that's why you should read things.
100%. But also, you'd have to be blind and deaf not to notice that there is an enormous upswell in America, in Britain, in Australia, in lots of places from people who are saying, I'm sick of being lectured to by a tiny percentage of people who believe that they're the only ones who are allowed to have an opinion.
And think they're smarter than me.
And think they're smarter than me. And we see it in the reporting that just makes everything worse about things like, well, if you were more educated, you'd vote like I vote.
Yeah,
like
I
you
hate
can't
that.
talk to people that way. It actually gives education a bad name because I hate to use the elitism word that is bandied around by the likes of Trump, but it's true.
Yeah.
And so I'm just loath to have that high ground that like if you had all the opportunities in life that led for you to be able to go to university and you had the kind of brain that thrives in an academic environment, you know, all of those things, then I should listen to you and I shouldn't listen to this other guy who might have a lot of lived experience and a lot of research that they've done themselves. I'm just not prepared to die on that hill. I think it's one of the things that's wrong with the world.
Out Louders. I reckon this has riled a lot of you up and I just really need to see it. You can share in the Out Louders group what university degree you think Holly should enroll in. No, I'm joking.
You know what, to be entirely honest, I'm now at that phase in my life 100% where I often think like, oh, you know, I'd love to go study, but I would be studying something out of interest, not, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, totally. But we want to know what you think and if the decline in expertise really has anything to do with university and if you're noticing, I mean, that elitism I think is one of the biggest issues at the moment because there's a kind of looking down on people that don't
100%.
have it and
And thinking that everyone would think the same if only they were as intelligent as I am
Which-
is just not true.
not true. Elfy, you have a recommendation.
I do, yes. Guys, I'm going to pull a Stevens recommendation here today because I'm going to recommend a show that came out in 2014.
Holy schmoly. Back to the rummaging around in the archives.
Mad Men era, yes.
So this show is called Jane the Virgin. You can find it on Stan. It is delightful.
Jane!
Nausea and fainting spell solved. You're pregnant.
But I've never had sex. Immaculata. You are Immaculata. What? No, Mom.
Clearly, she's not a virgin.
Of course I am. That's a mistake.
So basically, it starts with this premise of Jane, who is played by Gina Rodriguez. Amazing actor, gorgeous, and so captivating on screen. She is, yes, a virgin in the TV series, but becomes pregnant through a series of unfortunate events. It is funny. It's delightful. It is written like a telenovela.
I found that really fresh, that it was almost like a soap, but tongue-in-cheek, like funny.
Yes, totally. And it's too much plot, but in a way that they know it's too much plot. And it's like hilarious. It makes me laugh out loud, and like very few shows make me laugh out loud. Tonally, it kind of sits somewhere between Parks and Recreation and Arrested Development.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just amazing, and I would highly recommend watching it. It's the kind of just really heartwarming, very funny show that everybody needs in their life right now.
Yeah, you could watch a season in like a weekend. And I remember I got really, really into it when it came out, but there's been seasons since. I don't know how many seasons there are now, but I swear there was a second season I missed it or something.
And there's 1 million episodes per season. We looked at it last night. It's like 22 episodes for the first season.
Oh, it's great. If you're looking for something more to listen to, you haven't had enough of us. On yesterday's subscriber episode, Holly, Mia and Elfy helped an Out Louder with a very sticky wedding dilemma. The bride requested the guests attending her hen's party wear a specific shade of pink.
She sent a swatch.
A swatch.
Like a swatch of material.
Mia did. Did you bring this up in the subs episode that she did that to us once? Remember
No.
she explained to us what a colour palette was?
Oh, yes.
With
that's
headshots.
true.
And she had to send us what a colour palette
Oh,
was.
my God.
She did
I
not
didn't
admit
bring
that.
that up, and she did do that.
Oh, yes.
Oh, she did. Oh, my God. I should have brought that up.
So apparently this bride, though, we're talking flamingo pink, peach pink, magenta pink. Look, strong opinions about demanding people wear a certain thing. I mean, we are in a cost of living crisis. We cannot be buying a new outfit for every event.
Exactly.
A link to that episode will be in the show notes.
Thank you for listening to Australia's #1 news and pop culture show. As always, this episode was produced by Emeline Gazilas. The assistant producer is Tahli Blackman, and there's been audio production by Leah Porges. And I want to thank one Elfy Scott for filling in for Mia today.
Aw,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Holly. Thanks for having me.
Shout out to any Mamamia subscribers listening. If you love the show and you want to support us, subscribing to Mamamia is the very best way to do it. There's a link in the episode description.